I hadn't heard that name spoken out loud in almost 6 years. Not since the day I stood in a courtroom hallway, 18 years old, holding a folder of bank statements that proved she had drained every cent of the college fund my parents left me. $43,000. Gone. Spent on handbags, a leased BMW, and a kitchen renovation for a house I was never once invited into. I let it ring 3 more times before I picked up. Emily. Her voice cracked, thinner than I remembered. Please. I need your help. I have nowhere else to go. I sat there in the dark of my apartment, phone pressed to my ear, and for a moment I couldn't say a single word. Because the last time this woman spoke to me, it was to call me ungrateful. To tell a judge, under oath, that the money had gone toward my upbringing. To smile at me across a courtroom like she'd already won. And now she was crying, begging. From a woman who once looked me dead in the eye and said, "You should be thanking me." I hadn't planned on telling this story. But some things you carry so long, they start needing to be said out loud. To understand why that phone call nearly broke me, you have to go back to the beginning. Back to when I was 12 years old, sitting on a hospital hallway bench, watching my mother's hands shake as a doctor said words I didn't fully understand yet, aortic dissection, nothing more we can do. My father had died 8 months earlier. A construction accident. A steel beam, a moment of bad luck, and a life insurance payout that my mother swore she'd never touch except for one thing, my education. "This is yours," she told me, the week before she got sick, sliding a folder across our kitchen table. Inside were account statements. A trust, set up in my name, to be released when I turned 18. $43,000. Every bit of it earned through my father's death, my mother's grief, and years of her working double shifts as a hospital administrator to add to it herself. "No matter what happens to me," she said, "that money takes you to college. Promise me you'll go." 6 months later, she was gone too. I was 12 years old, an only child, both parents dead within a year of each other, and the only living relative willing to take me in was my mother's younger sister, my Aunt Denise. At first, it didn't seem so bad. Denise had a bigger house than we'd ever lived in, out in a neighborhood with manicured lawns and a pool she never let me swim in. She had a daughter, my cousin Chloe, 2 years older than me, who got a new car for her 16th birthday while I got a second-hand backpack for school. I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself I was lucky to have a roof at all. The trust fund, my mother's lawyer explained to Denise in front of me, was locked until I turned 18, untouchable, protected, mine. Denise nodded along, smiling that warm aunt smile she was so good at putting on for other adults. "Of course," she said. "It's Emily's." I'd never touch a cent of it. I believed her. I was 12. Why wouldn't I? The first crack came when I was 15. I found a letter in the recycling bin, a bank statement, torn in half, with my name on it. Emily R. Carter, custodial trust account. I fished the 2 halves out and taped them together at my desk with trembling hands. The balance line read $6,214. Not $43,000. $6,000. I remember staring at that number until the digits blurred. I told myself there had to be an explanation. Maybe fees. Maybe a market crash. Maybe I was wrong. So I asked her. Denise's face didn't even flinch. "Investments go up and down, sweetheart," she said, not looking up from her phone. "You don't understand how money works yet." I wanted to believe her. God, I wanted to believe her so badly, because the alternative, that the only person left who was supposed to protect me had been stealing from a dead woman's daughter, was too much for a 15-year-old to hold. So I buried it. I stopped asking questions. I got quieter. I got smaller. By the time I turned 17, Chloe had a closet full of designer clothes and a promise of a fully paid semester abroad. I had a part-time job at a grocery store that Denise insisted I take on to build character. I never once saw a receipt from that job go toward anything but my own bus fare and school lunches, the same bus fare and lunches, I'd later learn, that were supposed to be covered by the guardianship stipend the state paid Denise every single month. There was a night, I'll never forget it, when I came home from a closing shift and heard Denise on the phone in the kitchen, laughing. "No, it's fine. The renovations basically paid off." I told you I had some funds set aside. A pause. Then quieter, like she thought I wasn't close enough to hear. It's not like she needs all of it. She's got a job now. I stood frozen in the hallway, keys still in my hand, and something inside me went very, very still and very, very cold. That was the night I decided I was going to find out the truth. All of it. I started keeping copies. Every statement Denise forgot to shred, I photographed with my phone before she could throw it away. Every offhand comment about the renovation, the car lease, Chloe's trip, I wrote it down, dated, in a notes app disguised under a folder labeled chemistry homework. 2 months before my 18th birthday, the full trust statement came in the mail. Denise intercepted it like she always did. But this time, I intercepted it right back. While she was in the shower, I photographed all 6 pages, front and back, hands shaking so badly I had to retake half the photos. The final balance, as of that month, $1,842.19. $43,000. Reduced over 6 years to less than $2,000. I sat on my bedroom floor that night, and I did something I hadn't done since my mother's funeral. I cried until I had nothing left. Not because of the money, though God, the money mattered, but because I finally understood, with total clarity, that the woman raising me had looked at a grieving 12-year-old and seen an opportunity. On my 18th birthday, I didn't ask Denise for a party. I asked her, calmly, sitting across the same kitchen table where she'd once promised my mother's lawyer she'd never touch a cent, to see my trust account statement. She hesitated for exactly 1 second too long. It's complicated, Emily. There were some withdrawals for your care. Necessary things. Show me the account, I said. You're being dramatic. Show me the account, or I will. That was the first time I ever saw real fear in Denise's eyes. Not guilt. Fear. Because she knew, in that moment, that the quiet, obedient niece she'd spent 6 years training to stay small had just stopped being quiet. I want to pause here and tell you what it actually took to fight back, because it wasn't one dramatic confrontation. It was months. It was finding a legal aid clinic that agreed to take my case for free because a first-year attorney named Marcus Whitfield looked at my photographed bank statements and said 4 words I will never forget. This is a crime. It was learning, for the first time, that guardianship of a minor's trust comes with legal fiduciary duty, that what Denise had done wasn't just cruel, it was provably, criminally illegal. It was sitting across from a state investigator and recounting, in humiliating detail, every torn statement, every whispered phone call, every time I'd been told I was ungrateful for a life she'd built by spending my dead parents' money. It was Chloe, my own cousin, refusing to speak to me for 2 years afterward, because in her eyes, I had destroyed our family by telling the truth. The court date came 4 months later. I stood in that courthouse hallway with Marcus beside me and a manila folder of evidence that had taken me 3 years to secretly compile. Denise arrived in a tailored blazer, hair perfectly done, like she was attending a luncheon instead of a fraud hearing. She still smiled at me. That same warm smile. You'll regret this, she whispered as we passed each other. Family doesn't do this to family. I looked at her and said the only thing I had left in me, family doesn't steal from orphans, either. The hearing wasn't a full criminal trial. The state offered Denise a restitution agreement in exchange for avoiding formal embezzlement charges, given her otherwise clean record and the fact that I was, by then, already 18 and out of her legal custody. It wasn't the justice I dreamed of. But it was documented, on record, in the eyes of the law. Denise Harmon had misappropriated funds from a minor's custodial trust. She was ordered to repay $11,000 over time. She paid less than half of it before the payments quietly stopped, and I was too exhausted, too broke, and too done fighting to chase the rest through the courts. I walked out of that courthouse with $1,842.19 to my name and a piece of paper that said, officially, that I had been telling the truth. It wasn't enough to pay for 1 semester, let alone 4 years. But it was enough to know I wasn't crazy. I wasn't ungrateful. I had been right. What came after that is the part of this story I'm actually proud of. I worked 2 jobs my first year out of Denise's house, renting a room from a coworker's grandmother for $200 a month. I applied for every scholarship that existed for first-generation, orphaned, low-income students, and I got rejected from most of them. But not all. A regional scholarship for students who had overcome significant hardship covered my first year of community college. A professor there, who I confided in during office hours one exhausted afternoon, wrote me a letter of recommendation so strong it got me a transfer scholarship to a 4-year university 2 years later. I studied finance. Of all things. I wanted to understand, with total precision, exactly how money could be moved, hidden, and stolen so that no one could ever do to someone else what had been done to me. I graduated with honors, no debt, and a job offer from a mid-sized accounting firm before I even walked the stage. 6 years after that courthouse hallway, I was a licensed forensic accountant specializing in, I promise I'm not exaggerating this, financial fraud investigation. I spent my days finding exactly the kind of hidden withdrawals and disguised spending that Denise had once assumed a scared teenage girl would never be smart enough to catch. I never spoke to her again. Not once. Chloe reached out, eventually, years later, and we rebuilt something small and careful. But Denise and I were done. I thought we were done forever. Until that phone call at 11:47 p.m. "Please," she said again, her voice breaking through the receiver. "I lost my job in the spring. The house is in foreclosure. Chloe won't answer my calls. I have no one else, Emily. You're all I have left." I sat in silence for a long moment, running my thumb along the edge of my phone case, feeling something strange move through my chest. Not the rage I expected. Not even satisfaction. Something quieter. Something almost sad. "Denise," I said finally, "do you remember what you told the judge? About my college fund?" Silence on the line. "You said the money went toward my upbringing. Under oath. Do you remember that?" "Emily, that was so long ago." "I remember every dollar," I said. "I remember the BMW lease. I remember the kitchen renovation. I remember buying my own school lunches with grocery store paychecks while Chloe went to Cancun. I remember every single time you told me I should be grateful." "I made mistakes," she whispered. "I was struggling too after your mom died. I didn't know how to." "You knew exactly what you were doing," I said, cutting her off, my voice steady in a way that surprised even me. "You just never thought I'd become someone capable of proving it." There was a long, ragged breath on the other end of the line. And then, quietly, almost too quiet to hear, "I know I don't deserve anything from you. I didn't know who else to call." Here's the part of the story that I think about more than any other. The part where I had every single right, to hang up that phone and let her drown in the same wreckage she'd built for herself. And for about 30 seconds, I almost did. But I thought about my mother. About the woman who worked double shifts to build a future she never got to see, who trusted her own sister with her dying daughter, believing wrongly that blood meant safety. I thought about the 12-year-old girl I used to be, who just wanted someone, anyone, to protect her the way her mother had promised. And I realized something that took me years to understand. Becoming the kind of person who steals from a hurting child was Denise's choice. It didn't have to be mine to become the kind of person who turns her back on someone drowning, even someone who once tried to drown me. "I'm not giving you money," I said. "Not a cent. Not ever again. That door is permanently closed, and you already know why." "I understand," she said, and I could hear in her voice that she truly believed the conversation was over. "But," I continued, "I know a housing assistance program through the county. I can send you the application. And there's a financial counseling nonprofit I've done pro bono work for. They help people rebuild after foreclosure. I can connect you with them. That's what I'm willing to give. Not money. Direction." "Why?" she asked, her voice breaking again, this time with something that sounded almost like disbelief. "After everything I did?" "Because I refuse to let you turn me into someone who enjoys watching people suffer," I said. "Even you." I sent her those 2 links the next morning. A short, business-like message. No warmth, no forgiveness dressed up as reconciliation. Just 2 doors, and the choice of whether to walk through them. She replied 3 words, "Thank you, Emily." I never heard from her again after that. I don't know if she used the resources. I don't know if she rebuilt her life or lost it all over again. And for the first time in over a decade, I realized I didn't need to know. Her choices were no longer mine to carry. What I do know is this: the money she stole never came back. The years I spent counting grocery store paychecks and hiding bank statements under a fake homework folder never got returned to me. But somewhere between that courthouse hallway and this quiet phone call years later, I stopped being her victim. I became someone whose worth was never tied to what she stole in the first place. If there's one thing I want you to take from this story, it's this: some people will take everything from you and still expect gratitude for it. You are allowed to walk away from those people. You are allowed to protect your peace, even from family. Boundaries are not betrayal. But don't let what someone stole from you steal the rest of who you are too. Don't let their cruelty be the thing that teaches you cruelty back. I built a life Denise never thought I'd have the strength to build. And in the end, that turned out to be worth far more than $43,000 ever could have been. If this story moved you, I want to hear from you. Have you ever had to protect yourself from someone who was supposed to protect you? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. If you believe justice doesn't always look like revenge, hit like and subscribe, because there's another story waiting for you, and I promise, it's just as powerful as this one.